This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome aboard, folks. Here we are, Dr. Charles Parker, one more time at Core Brain Journal. This is episode 072, and we have a very interesting person with a whole different concept that a lot of you don't know about that's absolutely relevant, growing more and more relevant every day. Autism, sensory processing disorder. Welcome, Maria Rickert Hong from Westport, Connecticut. Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on.
Well, she's written a book on sensory processing disorder, folks, and we're going to learn about that. We're going to learn about her and its relevance. I mean, if you're even remotely interested in autism or pervasive developmental disorder, you can hear some more here in this program. So, first of all, Maria, tell us about yourself. Where are you? What's going on in your personal life? Who are you as a person, really?
Right. So I wasn't originally a health coach who helps parents recover their kids from autism and ADHD and sensory processing disorder. You know, I didn't originally help parents do that. I got into this because of what happened with my own children, of course, right? I used to be a financial equity research analyst on the sell side, worked for Solomon Smith Barney, Lehman Brothers, Jeffries and Company, and then Credit Lyonnais. And I quit my job when my older son was born. And I'm glad that I did, because he had a whole bunch of health problems, including developmental delays and low muscle tone. He could not sit up supported when he was 6 months old. He crawled backwards when he was 8 months old.
Oh my gosh, that would have been horrible.
Yeah, and it got worse. It got worse.
Oh my gosh.
He army crawled, which I don't know if you know what that is, but that's the commando crawling when a baby's on his belly.
Your belly's down. Oh yeah.
Yeah, instead of cross crawling, which is up on all fours, and he didn't cross crawl until he was 19 months old, and he didn't walk until he was 20 months old. So developmental delays. He had acid reflux. He would throw up after every meal. It would take him an hour to eat, and then he'd throw it all up. He lost weight when he was a baby, so he was failure to thrive. On top of the sensory issues as well, and then he had asthma too.
Wow, Maria, did you do breastfeeding, or what happened with that?
I did. Yeah, thank God I did. I mean, you know, he really could have been worse off for sure. So I'm glad that I did.
So then, now, forgive me, that now the physician in me is all curious about this, and I'm going to ask you, and you don't have to answer this, kind of personal question, but what did you find out about the factors that were causing all these obvious immunity challenges? When did you actually start to investigate that more thoroughly? What happened?
Well, I did not find out about it from the pediatricians, multiple pediatricians that we had. Did not find out about it from the gastroenterologist that we saw, because he only prescribed Prevacid and Miralax for the constipation. Did not find out about it from the allergist, because she said, oh, he doesn't have an anaphylactic allergy to anything. He's fine. It wasn't until I started having my own health problems, because I developed severe adrenal fatigue because his sensory issues were so bad. He would scream and cry for hours on end, nonstop, and it was just sucking the life out of me, honestly, right?
Yeah, so, absolutely. All day and every night.
And he would wake up 6 times a night, and I do not do well without sleep. I always say sleep deprivation is a form of torture, right?
Oh my gosh. Well, were you working on Wall Street at that time as well as having it? No. At that time you said, I just got to get out of this and take care of my child.
Right. That would have just been too much. So I'm so glad that I had quit my job when he was born. And so it wasn't until I started having my own health problems, especially the severe adrenal fatigue, that I started to see a naturopath and started to have really good results with him. He tested me for heavy metals because he knows that underneath that tip of the iceberg that are symptoms, that there are other things underneath, which I talk a lot about in my book, Almost Autism. And so when he tested me for heavy metals, mercury was off the charts, lead was very high. And so I had my boys tested, and my older son was at the 97th percentile for heavy metal toxicity, and my younger son was at the 90th. I'm like, holy cow,
Wow.
Nobody knows about this. Took it to the pediatrician. She's like, you don't live in a toxic waste dump. I'm like, lady, I don't think you understand what's going on.
Well, let me ask you a quick question here, because some of our listeners are professionals. Did you use, which laboratory? Did you use doctor's data, or did you use trace elements, or which one did you use? Doctor's data?
Doctors. Yep. I did the urine test for myself. And I would only say if a person is under the care of a naturopath or a functional medicine doctor to do that. But for my boys, I just did the hair test because it's non-invasive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the hair test and trace elements are relevant right there in the hair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then what happened after that? And you then began to look at chelation, the process of getting the heavy metals out, or what happened to you next?
Not initially. It was when my older son developed a severe bout of asthma pretty soon after I'd had him tested for heavy metals. And he had had asthma before, but this was really bad because we had been over in California visiting my in-laws, and there was a really bad forest fire up in the San Gabriel Mountains that lasted for pretty much the whole week that we were there. So we'd been sort of inhaling the smoke anytime we went outside. And so by the time we got back, my older son had a really severe asthma attack. He almost had to go to the hospital for it. And he didn't, thank God, but he was on a nebulizer. He's on Zopanex. He's on steroids, liquid steroids. And started taking him to the naturopath. I thought, well, he's helped me. Maybe he can help my son. So the first thing he says is cut out the dairy. I'm like, what? We've been to the gastroenterologist. He never mentioned this. We had him tested for dairy at the allergist. He goes, no, that's a different kind of allergic response. They're looking for the IgE response, which is the anaphylactic kind of thing. We're looking for the intolerances and the sensitivities, which is a completely different type of immune response. So, it really starts to open up a whole new world for me once I figured this out. So I cut out the dairy, and lo and behold, his asthma symptoms went away. And he stopped throwing up after every meal. And so I was able to get him off of Prevacid very quickly. And then I started doing my research about how horrible proton pump inhibitors are for your health. Mm-hmm. And I'm really angry at this point.
Listeners, I have to have you stop right there for a second, Maria, because I hear exactly what you said so many times a day. It's almost like a person needs to go back and just play that track again, because people think IgE is the answer, immunoglobulin E. I call that the immunoglobulin emergency. That's the obvious one. But testing for immunoglobulin G, which I call the ghost immunoglobulin, is the one that's down, lurking around, in which a person's having a reaction to something that's not obvious. And what I do, Maria, which you'll get a kick out of, because I'm down here in Virginia Beach, I'm not up in Westport, Connecticut, anywhere near New York or D.C., and it's kind of, even though it's a metropolitan area, it's a little bit on the Possum Hollow side. Okay. So people then wind up saying I'm a quack. He's a psychiatrist, what is he doing that for? Why should he? And I say, well, I'm hanging with Alessio Faisano, who is the chairman of pediatric gastroenterology at Harvard on this question.
Right.
And he lectures internationally. So in case you're wondering where I got my information, I'm hanging out with him. But this happens all the time. Your story is so provocatively accurate and so pervasively true. It's just amazing. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to punctuate that a little bit because it's so good. So then what happened? You were then started looking at the food sensitivities. Did you actually get IgG testing?
No, I never did.
You just did the milk itself. You just said milk solved it. That's very interesting.
Well, it solved a lot. And then I thought, well, what else is there that they're not telling me? And so I took out the dairy, and then I discovered that a lot of times when you look up dairy-free recipes, you also get gluten-free recipes. And so I started looking into gluten intolerances. And when I did that, a lot of the sensory sensitivities started to go away. I'm like, I'm really onto something here. Then I discovered that there's this whole subset of the autism community that looks at taking out certain foods, especially gluten and casein, from their kids' diets to help with symptoms. And the problem for me was that my son never had autism. He had sensory processing disorder. Now, kids with autism have sensory processing disorder, but it can also be a standalone diagnosis, although it is not a diagnosis in the DSM-5, right? They're trying to get it in there, but it's not in there.
Okay, let's freeze frame this conversation right here. Pardon me for interrupting, because this is a very, very important part of the conversation. Just remember, listeners, that Maria has written a book, Almost Autism, Recovering Children from Sensory Processing Disorder, a reference for parents and, get this, practitioners. And there's going to be a drawing at corebrainjournal.com, 072 drawing, so that you could enter to possibly receive a gift of her book. So let's really break down sensory processing disorder a little more effectively, how it relates to autism, so people can get a little more of a visual grasp of what's going on, or conceptual grasp of what's going on.
Okay. So there are 3 types of kids with sensory processing disorder. So the first type is the type that my kids were, and they are sensory avoiders. Those are, the lights are too bright, the sounds are too loud, the motions can be upsetting to them, especially things like swings and playground equipment and merry-go-rounds. They get car sick a lot. They need to wear certain kinds of clothing because, the tags may upset them. They need to have seamless socks kind of kids. Then you can have kids that are sensory seekers, and these are the heavy metal kind of headbanger kind of kids that really like the loud music and the, bright lights and all that, and they crash into people on purpose because they need that sensory input. And then you can have kids that are sort of a mix of both. And so for, like I said, kids that have autism, I think across the board from all that I've ever discovered have sensory processing disorder, but sensory processing disorder can also be a standalone diagnosis if it were to be a diagnosis. And so kids with autism also have more symptoms like the lack of sociability. They may not be making eye contact. They may have problems with speech. My sons didn't have that. So it was just the sensory issues. But at least I kind of had something to grab onto and understand what was going on, as far as what was helping the autism community could also help my kids. And so that's when I discovered, like I said, how much diet can really help.
Well, let's tease this part even a little more if you can, and you can teach me, because I'm looking forward to hearing what your response to this is. So let's break down sensory processing. So it has to do with the way a human being, child or adult, is dealing with stimuli from the outside world.
Yes.
It can be visual, it can be auditory, it can be tactile, it can be temperature.
Yep.
And so when they're having a sensory processing disorder, they either avoid all sensory things and they stay in the room almost in the darkness, put the headphones on sort of thing. And then there's the sensory seekers. Now, I know a little bit about this right here. So the one thing that hits me, and I'm interested in your response, sensory avoiders frequently are going to have a cryptopyrrole problem.
Yeah, interesting,
And
right?
They do, because I knew about the cryptopyrrole, but I didn't really have a label for sensory avoiders. That's a very interesting point. And what happens with now my curiosity up is about sensory seekers. Do you have a common biologic contribution to that one that occurs to you?
I haven't seen that one in particular. No.
I was thinking, you said heavy metal, and you were talking about bands, but I was actually thinking about heavy metal intoxication when you said that, because that was,
Oh, that's true. That's true.
but I don't know if that's true or not. I just thought I'd raise that.
Well, and so that's as I went further on down of the path of recovering both myself and my kids, I began to understand those core things, those core causes of autism, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, developmental delays, learning disabilities, and then really onwards, anything from autoimmune disorders to mood disorders to bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, you name it. It's all sort of the same. Allergies, asthma, right? So
Yeah.
there's a great book by Dr. Kenneth Bach that was a real help to me, and it is Healing the New Childhood Disorders. He talks about the 4A disorders. It starts with allergies, goes to asthma, then ADHD, and then to autism, and he really pieces it together in a great way.
Yeah, he's great. I've listened to him a couple of times at different meetings, and he's articulate. The book itself is interesting. I've got to get him as a guest, to tell you the truth, because he's such a great guy. And the book really breaks it down. It was a turning point in my life. I went to a Dan conference, and he was there, and I was already interested in ADHD, of course, so I walked into the room, and then he started, talking about this, and it's been quite a while ago when that happened. It was transformational for me as it was for you.
Right. And it's so nice to have somebody draw that bigger picture and put the pieces together, because, and this is what's happened, is that, a lot of people who have kids with autism are sort of over here, and then the parents who have a child with ADHD are over here, and they don't think they have anything in common. Then the kids with allergies and asthma, they're over here, and the mood disorders are over there, and nobody realizes that there's so much common ground, including the toxicity, like Dr. Kenneth Bach talked about, right? And I wrote about as well, and I was finding out on my own anyway, because of the heavy metal tests.
So you came into it from really more of a, if you'll forgive the expression, more of a macro world with children who are obviously developmentally impaired. And the way I came into it is my own attempts to do everything right with ADHD children and adults, and treatment failure. So I'm doing everything right. I make the diagnosis from a brain function point of view, from the background that I've had in SPECT imaging. So I have that whole prefrontal cortex thing worked out in my mind with hypoperfusion and all that sort of thing. And I have that in my mind, and I'm doing all these things right according to even a bit deeper understanding. But then you have to go down to this next level, which is what are the underlying molecular causes that aren't really seen with SPECT imaging. And it's sort of like, okay, you spent $3,700 on SPECT imaging, but you have these issues going on with cryptopyrrole or methylation issues that are actually contributed by the immune system dysregulation and the food sensitivity. It's amazing.
And thank God that you, as a psychiatrist, are understanding how, as Dr. Martha Herbert, she's an MD, PhD with Harvard Medical School.
She's great.
She's awesome. Yeah. She says autism is not a brain disorder. It is a whole body condition. And once you start to heal the body, then the brain starts to heal, right? And especially when you talk about the gut, because there is that gut-brain connection. And Dr. Kelly Brogan, she's an MD psychiatrist. You probably heard of her. She has recently written a book called A Mind of Her Own, where she talks about the whole mind-body connection and how depression is not really a deficiency of an SSRI. It's other things going on in the body, like inflammation, right?
Yeah, I met her actually just last weekend up in D.C. There was a very good conference. She's a great gal, and she really had a lot to say in that regard. It was a very, very interesting meeting. But every person you've mentioned are people who are looking at the entire complexity of the situation, as opposed to, hey, let's just throw some meds at it. Let's really figure out what's going on.
You're only going to get the suppression of the symptoms with the medication, and you're also going to get side effects. And as my other favorite doctor, Sherry Rogers, MD, says, the sick get sicker quicker when they're on medication, because it creates toxicity and it creates nutritional deficiencies. Well,
and Sherry is a great person too. You're really doing your homework here, because you've hit the folks that are really very much on it. Now, I don't know if Faisano has written a book. I know that he's you see him on video and YouTube all the time. The guy at Harvard with pediatric gastroenterologist, because he talks about it. But I don't think he's probably quite over as far as these guys are on the functional medicine side. You know, it's an interesting thing. I'd like your feedback on this, because I see what's happening is that there's a split regarding what happens with children in this regard, because it's sort of like either you're on the functional medicine side or you're on the traditional side.
Right.
And then the patient winds up getting caught in the middle. Who do they actually talk to? Because, you know, the traditional people think that the functional medicine people are all quacks, even though they're looking at good data from peer-reviewed resources.
That's true.
Then the functional medicine people tend to say all those traditional guys are lost because, and really medications are used so incorrectly that there's a lot of truth to what they're saying regarding traditional medicine input, you know, so.
Right. There was an article today in the Wall Street Journal talked about how it was really talking about older people and how many older people are on such, you know, a handful, like at least 5 pharmaceutical medications, right? And so you can say the same thing about our kids, that, you know, kids today, 54% of American children have some kind of chronic illness, whether it is autism or ADHD or allergies or asthma or mood disorders or, you know, just chronic sickness and chronic runny noses, and they're on tons of medication. And to not look at the underlying causes of what's going on, it's just beyond me. I don't really understand why they don't. But the good thing is that a lot of doctors are making that switch into functional medicine. So
I think that's true. It's amazing. I was at the American Psychiatric Association a year and a half ago now, maybe almost 2 years ago in Toronto. And it was really interesting because these are all the traditional guys. And yet there were a number of individuals from traditional medical facilities who were saying, look, this gut thing is causing a problem. And the traditional psychiatrists were like, oh my gosh, it was actually one of the reasons I went, because I feel like I'm on the edge myself. And I wanted to see how far on the edge I actually am. Right. And it turned out I was very reassured, because exactly what you said is going on. A lot of traditional people are thinking more comprehensively and reasonably about it, and getting rid of the polarization that occurs.
And I think a lot of that may actually come from their own children, from anecdotal stories that I've had with healthcare practitioners and MDs as well, who have their own sick child, and they're starting to figure out that, hey, there's more to what's going on. Because when you and I were kids didn't have these kind of sicknesses and illnesses and disorders, right? What's going on? So,
well, that's a good point. Now let's take it back to your book a little bit, because, you know, in the Almost Autism, you're really talking about really developmental issues that have biologic origins and etiologies, for want of a better expression.
Sure.
So in your book, or where are you in your development as a counselor advisor, where do you first go when you are beginning to assess individuals with these challenges? What's your thought about that?
Well, I want to look at their history, you know, their GI kind of history. Are they picky eaters? Do they have chronic constipation or chronic diarrhea? Because most of them do. Are they on a lot of medication? Because most of them are. Are their vaccines up to date? You know, that can play a role as well. I look at their developmental history as well. You know, a lot of these kids, the parents and the doctors tend to think that they developed fine, but they're not understanding how these neurodevelopmental disorders can play out even very young, even before the diagnosis occurs. And so, you know, that child who just basically skipped the crawling phase and started walking, they think, oh, she's just an early walker. That's great. No, that developmental phase is actually very important for the way that the brain gets wired. It wires the vestibular system and the vision system and the auditory system, you know, including some of the other systems as well. And so it's that kid who skipped a phase, or that kid who butt scooted across the floor instead of crawling, or dragged a leg across the floor, and they said, oh, isn't that cute? There's actually something wrong with that. And I know I had gone to my pediatricians, saying there's something wrong. There's something wrong. Oh, don't worry about it. He's a boy. He'll grow out of it.
Yeah.
It's nothing. And then finally, when he was 18 months old, they actually called a Connecticut birth to 3. He's 18 months old. And of course, by the time we got the appointment, he started walking like a few weeks later. So it's just really something that needs to be looked at even earlier.
Well, it's really easy to be passionate about it because it's so pervasive. I mean, it's not like you have to be worried that you're going to say something wrong. I mean, it's all over the place. And
it is.
The real issue is if you're not paying attention, you're in, politically correct word is a state of innocence. The more direct word is complete denial of reality.
Okay, that's a nice way of putting it. Yes.
Let's deal with reality. I mean, I think, this is what you're doing. You're offering people a look at the reality of a mom who was a, investment counselor in Wall Street, who came down and had a reality in her face when she's working in a very complex world, has to come into a complete unknown with another whole series of complex realities herself.
Right.
It's a big doggone deal. So then next level, back to it. So would you have any specific thoughts? And I know you're not a physician. I'm really not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just talking with you as a participant in this growth knowing process. Do you have a specific set of tests that you think, in terms of our audience, that you would say, hey, as a mom, I think these are some things you should think about getting test-wise when your children have these developmental challenges?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, that heavy metal hair test that I spoke about earlier, it's not expensive. It's very easy to do. You can order it yourself if you really want to from, I think it's directlabs.com, where you can go through your naturopath or functional medicine doctor. So that's always a good one. And just to understand where you're starting. Right? Because a lot of these kids have heavy metal toxicity and nobody's talking about it. The Environmental Working Group wrote about it in 2005 when they published the Body Burden Report, Pollution in Newborns, where they found that there were a total of 287 different toxic chemicals, including heavy metals and carcinogens and endocrine disruptors in the cord blood of a newborn, meaning that it could only have come from the mother. And so each baby had an average of 200 of these different toxic chemicals in them.
This is pervasively true. It's not like an odd person came in with it.
No. Right.
Go ahead, please.
It's compounding with every generation because we're continually being exposed to toxicity, whether you want to think about it or not, or stick your head in the sand and go la la la. It's not happening to me, right? And then it's, the moms have silver fillings. Silver fillings are actually half mercury, and that mercury actually leaches into your body. It actually off-gases into the body. So that's a problem. That's a major source of the mercury inside of us. We're all told when we're pregnant, don't eat the fatty fish because there's mercury in the fish because that bioaccumulates, right? But we're not told, make sure that you get those silver fillings removed for a couple of years before you even think of having a kid, because that toxicity gets passed. And it's not just the heavy metals, but, many other things that get passed as well.
Well, I was interested in that last comment that you had. That's probably been 3 or 4 years ago now, driving to work, listening to National Public Radio. And I was quite amazed because I'd been into this for a while, but they were talking about mothers who have food sensitivities, sharing with the intrauterine experience of the child that blood, actually highlighting it for when the child passes out of the mother's body to already be primed to be vulnerable from a sensitivity point of view, just from the experience of being in mom who was eating bread or drinking milk.
Yep.
And that was in the Wall Street Journal.
Right. It's there if you look for it, right?
And so then what happens is people say, this isn't true. Well, why? It's just amazing. So
it's hidden in plain sight, right?
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
So then let me ask you this question. So then what's that next step? You get some of the testing and you get them on the diet. What would you say would be an impasse in the parents that you've spoken with in the next level of, okay, I'm lost, I've done this and I've done that, now there's a theme of being lost, that next step. Do you have something that occurs to you about that?
Well, for one, it's really overwhelming to go through this process of recovery. I know I've had to do it myself, and I know plenty of other moms who have done the same for their children and recovered their kids. And it's an overwhelming thing because you look at the world, you think, oh my God, we can't believe anything that we're told anymore. We can't believe the USDA or the EPA or the CDC. Everybody's in bed with corporations. They're all lying to us for their profit and not for our health. And so you really have to educate yourself. So there's that paralysis and that fear and that overwhelm that a lot of moms, and it's usually moms that I work with, experience. And then in a lot of cases, the mother has her own health problems. And so trying to get her to understand that, working on herself while she's working on her child can be a big help as well, because it's really helpful to have that one big jump in your health, that one big improvement. And if you can experience it for yourself, then that's the biggest motivator ever. And so I really try to get the parents on board with what I do too, and to try to really look at the whole family and try to help them understand that it's not just your child, it's what's going on with you as well.
That's a very, very key point. That's great, because if they can see that, then they feel it. It's the experience of actually understanding it from within. Then and furthermore, it builds a little hope, because they're an adult. Their problems are probably less pervasive.
Right.
And yet they can experience even a little. Then they can say, okay, well, if it can help me at this low level, then perhaps it can help me with another. Yeah.
Right, which is what happened with me. Like I started experiencing improvement in my own health, working with my naturopath. I thought, well, hey, I did the diet for my kids. But then I started taking some of the things that my naturopath was doing and applying it to my kids as well. And then he started working with them as well. I'm thinking, oh, wait, hey, there's crossover here, right? So
how do you work that in your consultative practice? Do you have clients who are going to be speaking with you line up specific things before you actually talk to them that you want to hear from them, or do you pretty well do it on the fly? Sounds like less structured, but that's really what I'm talking about. Is it structured or is it unstructured?
Both.
How do you work?
It's both, honestly. So I have a framework that I work with, and it sort of parallels what I talk about in my book. And so when you're talking about recovery from anything, I don't care if it's cancer or heart disease or lupus or autism or ADHD, the first thing you have to do is to lower the stress. Because a lot of these, you cannot heal if you're in a constant state of stress, because the body is in a state of fight or flight. You really need to be in that rest and digest phase. The body cannot heal unless it is. And so it's helping parents understand the things that they can do to lower stress for themselves and for their kids, and so that the healing process can begin. And
Great piece of advice. What a good place to start.
It is, right? Yeah. Well, if you could just get over that first hurdle, so much can happen. You can start sleeping better.
Do you do meditation? Do you recommend that they do meditation? Where are you with that whole process of de-stress?
It can help, but I actually recommend doing certain foods into the diet first. Making sure that there are a lot of minerals, because we are such a mineral deficient society, especially in magnesium, as I write about. Dr. Carolyn Dean, she's an MD, wrote about in the Magnesium Miracle, and how magnesium is so critical for stress response, and how if we are deficient in magnesium, we're just going to be overly stressed. And if you are stressed, and also if you eat sugar, a lot of sugar, you burn a lot of magnesium. And so
I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So the candida people who have the candida, who are sugaraholics just because they're feeding the candida, are pulling the magnesium out. That's very interesting. I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So you get them eating right, and then you move on down the road. I'm also looking at the time right now, so it's a very interesting conversation, but we have to begin to wind up. Summarize, if you will, some of the handicaps that you see for the long run. Any kind of advice for the listeners regarding how to hang in there?
Well, like I said before, just doing it for yourself can be a really big motivator, or, doing some kind of dietary intervention, elimination diet or whatever, to see that your child does have big improvements with that can be such a big motivator. And so I think once you get that motivation and recognize that improvement for yourself, then, you'll just keep going forward and see what's next. Let's start looking at the gut. Let's start looking at pyrrole, disorder, something like that, right? So
get the testing and get further into it with actual data.
Right.
Really figure out what the data is. I think the data is the big turnaround for most people. It keeps people on track. If they've got in black and white in front of them and they can see this out, takes it away from the magic of words.
Right. Well, and that's where a journal can come into play as well. And so I really recommend that people keep a journal of both their own health symptoms and their child's, and, anything that you are doing that might change that, whether you're doing something for better, like an elimination diet, like eliminating gluten and dairy, or you're adding things in like magnesium, see how it plays out for the next few days. Did the child start focusing better? Were they a little less hyperactive? Once you took out artificial colors, was he less hyperactive and aggressive? Did he stop wetting the bed? There's so many things that you can do.
So true. Well, Maria Rickert Hong, author of Almost Autism, thank you so much for taking the time with us. I hate to cut this off. We could talk for a long time.
I can talk for hours about this.
I just enjoy speaking with you so much because you're so real, so authentic, and you have a street knowledge that is so helpful for listeners because you're not coming at it from an ivory tower. This is real. This is you. You're a mom. This is what you experienced. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book, to tell you the truth. And I look forward to having you back sometime.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And I should have you on my monthly webinar as well.
I hope to be so. It'd be a lot of fun for me. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.